It was the year 1347. The ports of Sicily were bustling with life, unaware that the gates of hell were about to open upon Europe. It began on a cold October morning when 12 Genoese trading galleys slowly drifted into the harbor of Messina. The people on the docks waved, expecting treasures of silk and spices from the Black Sea. But as the ships drew closer, an eerie, suffocating silence hung over the water. No sailors called out from the decks. No anchors were dropped willingly. When the port authorities finally climbed aboard, they gasped in pure horror. The decks were literal slaughterhouses. Most of the sailors were already dead, their corpses rotting in the sun, piled on top of one another. The few who still clung to life were barely human. They were delirious, weeping from intense pain, and covered from head to toe in mysterious, sickening black boils that oozed foul-smelling blood and pus. The Sicilian authorities, panicked and terrified, ordered the fleet to leave the harbor immediately. They forced the ships back into the sea with flaming arrows. But it was already too late. The curse had landed. It did not need the sailors to walk ashore. It only needed the dark, unseen hitchhikers hiding within the grain sacks in the cargo holds, thousands of infected black rats, carrying millions of invisible, deadly fleas. Within days, the first whispers of a strange, unstoppable sickness began to echo through the narrow, crowded streets of Messina. The disease spread with a speed that defied human comprehension. It was a phantom that struck in the dead of night, entering homes through the smallest cracks. First came the shivering chills, followed by a burning, unquenchable fever. Then, the signature mark of the demon appeared, the buboes. These were massive, painful swellings that emerged in the groin, under the armpits, and around the neck. They grew to the size of a common apple or a large egg. At first, they were a fiery red, then they turned deep purple, and finally, a rotting, necrotic black. The agony was so intense that victims shrieked in madness, unable to bear the touch of their own clothing. In the final stages, the infection turned inward, liquefying the lungs. Victims began vomiting dark, clotted blood, their breath turning so foul and toxic that it could be smelled from feet away. Everything that came from an infected person, their breath, their sweat, their tears, carried the seeds of immediate death. People who woke up perfectly healthy in the morning were often buried before the sun set. Science was completely useless. Doctors, trembling with fear behind their primitive remedies, tried everything. They lanced the black boils with red-hot irons, applied crushed dried toads to the wounds, and forced patients to swallow powdered gold or dissolved pearls. Nothing worked. The rich died in their grand stone mansions just as fast as the beggars died in the muddy gutters. Death had become the only true equalizer in Europe. As the months bled into 1348, the fabric of human civilization completely unraveled. Fear turned men into monsters. The living grew so accustomed to the constant presence of death that they lost all sense of humanity. Parents, terrified for their own survival, abandoned their sick children, leaving them to die alone in dark rooms, crying out into the empty streets. Wives fled from their husbands at the first sign of a cough. The church bells, which used to ring out for funerals, fell completely silent. There were simply too many dead to count, and ringing the bells only drove the remaining citizens into absolute madness. The streets turned into open graves. Every morning, families would drag the cold bodies of their loved ones to their doorsteps. Giant wooden carts rumbled through the cobblestones in the dead of night, driven by desperate criminals who were forced into the work. Their hollow voices echoed through the dark, "Bring out your dead. Bring out your dead." The corpses were thrown into massive communal pits, stacked layer upon layer like bales of hay, covered with a thin dusting of quicklime to hide the horrific smell. Beautiful cities like Florence, Paris, and London turned into rotting ghost towns. Markets were abandoned. Crops rotted untouched in the fields, and starving cattle wandered aimlessly through deserted villages, carrying the disease further into the countryside. In the midst of this apocalyptic landscape, strange and terrifying figures began to appear. These were the plague doctors. To protect themselves from the toxic air, which people believed carried the sickness, they wore long, heavy coats made of dark leather, coated in thick wax. On their heads, they wore wide-brimmed black hats and terrifying leather masks with large glass eyes and long, pointed bird beaks. The beaks were stuffed with strong aromatic herbs, like dried roses, lavender, and mint, meant to drown out the smell of rotting flesh. They walked through the dying streets like giant, silent crows, carrying a long wooden cane to examine patients without ever touching them. To the citizens, the appearance of a plague doctor was a modern death sentence. They were the grim reapers of the medieval world. At the same time, religious hysteria gripped the population. Believing that the plague was a literal whip of God's wrath sent to punish mankind for their sins, brotherhoods of fanatics known as the Flagellants emerged. They traveled from town to town in massive, silent processions, barefoot and draped in dark robes. In the town squares, they formed large circles and whipped themselves rhythmically with heavy leather scourges embedded with sharp iron spikes. They chanted dark, mournful hymns as blood poured down their shredded backs, praying for mercy. But their bloody rituals only made things worse. The open wounds on their bodies became perfect breeding grounds for the bacteria, and as they moved from village to village, they unknowingly carried the plague to every single community they visited. By the time the fury of the Black Death finally began to wane in 1351, the world had changed forever. It is estimated that between 75 million and 200 million people were wiped off the face of the earth. More than half of Europe's entire population was gone. Entire villages were completely erased from maps, reclaimed by the advancing forests. The silence that settled over the continent was heavy and deafening. Yet, from the ashes of this unprecedented catastrophe, a new world began to slowly take shape. The old feudal system, which had enslaved the poor for centuries, collapsed entirely because there were no longer enough peasants alive to work the lands of the lords. Labor became valuable, giving rise to higher wages and better living conditions for the survivors. Human beings began to question the absolute power of the medieval church, sparking a wave of scientific curiosity, art, and philosophy that would eventually pave the way for the Renaissance. The Black Death was a cruel, monstrous fire that burned medieval Europe to the ground, but in doing so, it left behind a blank canvas upon which the modern world was built. But the memory of the black boils, the hollow rattle of the death carts, and the terrifying shadow of the bird-masked doctor would remain burned into the human psyche for centuries to come, a permanent reminder of the day the world almost died.